So just a couple of real quick notes here. If you do wish to go to track 2, the current theme over there is using current data and best practices for wildfire risk reduction. With that said, our session here is coordinating with external sectors and states, new cross-sector tools for business continuity planners. Please note the Q&A button down at the bottom left of your screen. If you have any questions or anything for the panelists, please feel free to pop those in here throughout the session, and we'll try to address those on the backside. So with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. And this is a gentleman who has seen it all and his truly esteemed group of panelists. Over to Kent Kildow. He's the chair of the SICE GIS working group. He's also the director of business continuity and emergency management for Verizon. So if it happens, he hears about it, and he's the one who gets the calls at 3 in the morning, along with the other folks that are on this line. So you've got the real deal here, folks. So over to you, Kent.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Dell, and welcome everyone. I hope that you're enjoying the day so far. Always amazed by the broad set of topics covered here as part of the summit. I think we have a good, well, I know we have a good conversation today and some great representation for this panel. We're going to talk about cross-sector coordination and the use of exercises to really extend those conversations. I'm going to ask all 3 of my panelists to come on screen at this point and start with some quick introductions. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their current roles and their backgrounds in this industry and why they joined the SICE. And then the last thing I'll ask for is one quick item on something you like to do when you're not focused on emergency management. So with that, I'm going to start by asking Persia to introduce herself. Persia?
Hey, hi everybody. Good afternoon. I appreciate that, Kent. My name is Persia Payne Hurley. I'm the private sector manager for North Carolina Emergency Management. I also coordinate our business EOC. I've been there for 8 years and had the honor of starting the North Carolina BEOC, and that's nice. We focused on incorporating the private sector into the state EOC, our response team and direct recovery efforts. And at the time, we didn't really know what we were going to do and where we were going and what we were really after. But it worked out pretty well. So during blue skies, I look for gaps, places where the private sector can shore up public health efforts all along the EM elements and enhance public safety, and also how the public sector can support private sector efforts to continue operations across the state, gain emergency access and reentry through our statewide reentry program, and to also particularly in restricted and curfew areas, which we have a lot of those. I also mentor as many as my state counterparts as I can, since we do not have a formal training program for this role. And the All Hazards Consortium has allowed me to chair the Private Sector State Liaison Committee, which is a blast. I did not have any EM background experience prior to this role. I believe that God reinvented me, and I was allowed to join EM's team. In my past life, I had a blast training and commanding drill sergeants for the Army. I retired from that, spent 14 years in property casualty and disaster for the insurance industry. And I participate in this All Hazards Committee work group because it extends our state's vision on situational awareness for private sector needs. It helps us to uncover joint capabilities, and it adds to the resilience, I think, of both sectors. So I love problem solving, getting into the nitty gritty of that work, and that's what the All Hazards Consortium is super great at doing. So that's kind of me. I like to find common denominators that prove that we are all in the same boat on this big blue marble. I believe in the symbiotic relationship between businesses and community. You know, just a lot of philosophies in there, Kent. So I do also think that we all have the blessing of being in what is one of the most amazing jobs on the planet. And that's kind of me.
Thank you, Persia. That's amazing. Thank you for all of that. Kelly, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Persia is a hard act to follow. I'll give you my best shot. Kelly McKinney, I'm a working emergency manager. I'm the assistant vice president of emergency management at NYU Langone Health in New York City. I have been working in the emergency management business in New York for 22 years. And I can tell you it's been a very, very busy 2 decades for me. I'm a board member of the All Hazards Consortium. I've been a disciple of Tom Moran for over a decade. I believe in the mission of the All Hazards Consortium. And the reason I'm on this panel in particular is because this issue of exercises is, to me, the most important tool in the resilience toolbox. It's really the only way to gain insight into what would actually happen during a disaster response. So I'm passionate about this tool and looking forward to talking about it.
All right, that's great, Kelly. Thank you. And last but hardly least, Tom, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tom, you're still on mute.
So I was, thank you. And thanks, Kent, for the kind introduction. Appreciation to my colleagues in this panel and to all those who've opted to join this discussion this afternoon. I know you have demanding schedules and you have to make a decision to do this, and we appreciate that commitment. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Security with the Association of American Railroads. Been in the job for coming up on 13 years. And in that capacity, I'm privileged to represent the North American railroad industry. That includes freight and passenger railroads. So our principal members are the 7 Class 1 freight railroads, the largest operations in the U.S. and Canada. That comprises BNSF Railway, CN Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, CSX Transportation, Kansas City Southern, Norfolk Southern, and Union Pacific. In addition, one of our principal members is Genesee and Wyoming Railroad. It owns and operates dozens of short line and regional railroads around the U.S. and Canada. We have a sizable number of regional and short line carriers directly, and Amtrak and a significant number of commuter railroads are part of our membership as well. I say privilege, I mean it. This is an incredibly talented and dedicated group, and I am in a position to support their efforts both in security planning, execution, and emergency preparedness, including prevention and response. I came to the SICE largely through the regard I gained over time for those who are actively participants in it or those who are founders of it. So that includes Tom Moran and Laura Johnston, the All Hazard Consortium. It includes my colleagues on this panel, Persia and Kelly. When you work in emergency response, you hear from these leaders on a regular basis in various forums, including the daily conference calls that were described in the last presentation. And you recognize the expertise and the experience they bring to bear. And so I had hoped that there was perhaps something I could contribute, but most importantly, I could learn from these professionals. I'm also privileged to serve as the chair of a group called the Surface Transportation Security Advisory Committee. That's appointed by the administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, directed by statute to establish this forum. It's his principal advisory group on matters pertaining to security and emergency preparedness in surface transportation. So that includes my counterparts in pipelines, mass transit, trucking, postal and shipping, maritime, and long distance busing. What do I do when I'm not doing this work? One word, baseball, whether it's playing it, talking about it, integrating it into presentations, or hopefully here in the near term, writing about it. So that's an overview of who I am, where I come from. Other background was some time at TSA. Most of my experience was in the US military prior to that as an intelligence officer in the Army in the 1980s and a judge advocate in the Air Force in the 1990s and mid 2000s. Thanks.
All right, thank you, everyone. Obviously, an amazing breadth and depth of experience and knowledge here. I would be remiss if I did not express my appreciation for both Tom and Persia's service to our nation. Thank you for what you did while being in uniform. So thank you for that. With that, why don't we go ahead and start talking a little bit about kind of the landscape that many of us work in and why we thought that this was an important discussion to have. I'm going to start out with a question for Kelly. I think as business continuity and emergency management professionals, many of us have been involved in numerous internal exercises over the years, working within our organizations to improve our ability to respond to disasters. But there's a little bit of a difference when you start talking about public, private, and cross-functional. Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on what that cross-functional exercise brings that you might miss in an internal exercise?
Yeah, Kent, that's a great question. And so I spent 8 years at the New York City Office of Emergency Management. So and then I've been over a decade in New York City government. So I get the government side. I also worked in the private sector. I was a consulting engineer before I got into the emergency management business. And so I've been in both of those silos, and I can tell you that they both have an internal logic. They both have dedicated workforces, and they both have missions that they strive to achieve on a daily basis. But there are no thicker silo walls in the resilience landscape than those around the government and the private sector. They are wholly separate and apart. They work differently. They think differently. They don't understand each other. They don't trust each other in a lot of ways. And so, that seems to work for society on a daily basis. It doesn't work during disasters, and that really is the crux of the matter, right? I mean, this nation has the most robust and powerful private sector that the world has ever known. And if we can't utilize that in a disaster to help people, then that's failure. That's the definition of failure. And so the only way, I've been in a lot of meetings where governments and the private sectors have talked about this. And those meetings they're not a waste of time. They're useful, especially getting those connections, because then people start to know each other, and then when the job happens, they can call each other. But a meeting, I'll just tell you, we do a lot of exercises in my shop. I've done dozens and dozens over my career. We just did one with the leadership of my organization just on Tuesday morning, and we have one rule in our exercises, and that is that we're not going to have a meeting. This is not a meeting. This is an exercise, and there's a difference. And we're going to put ourselves into that scenario. We're going to imagine that we're there, and we're going to act as if we are there. And that changes the mindset, and it enables learning like no other tool that I've experienced. So that's for me why it's really so important, Kent.
That's great, Kelly. And I think you've done a great job of kind of bringing out the importance of that type of exercise. Building on that, Persia, collaboration doesn't happen overnight, and it takes some TLC to develop. I know you've spent endless hours in North Carolina fostering cross-sector collaboration. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done to help engender that collaboration within your state?
Kent, Kelly makes a good point. It's the things that we do. There's no doubt that this type of collaboration has to happen if we're going to be successful, if we're really going to capitalize on everything that we bring in this nation. And for me, and in North Carolina, incorporating those partnerships into our state EOC meant that they needed to be part of the conversation. They needed a seat at the table. And not only that, but they needed to understand that they had our respect as partners. They weren't just some folks that we were going to come to and talk to only when we felt like talking. And I know that's a big problem sometimes for government, but they had our respect. So I'm fond of saying that one of the mistakes that we make on the government side when we approach the private sector to build partnerships is that we forget that it's a relationship. And sometimes we fall into that habit of making a fourth date request on the first date. I say that a lot. So it's funny, but it gets the point across. And who would stand for that? So, sometimes when I see colleagues on my side, at least, although they talk about they want to engage the private sector, but I see them leaning towards that, fourth date request on the first date. I ask them, would you date you? kind of like the question my mother asked me when I was like 14. So you understand. So inviting the private sector folks to exercise with us, we do it with an eye towards enhancing joint operations. They join us for statewide exercises, BEOC, TTXs. We do WebEOC quarterly drills to keep everybody's skills sharp. And we've granted them access to WebEOC. And that's been a big thing for us, so that they can see in real time live posts during events from not just North Carolina Emergency Management, but all of our state agencies, Highway Patrol, DOT, National Guard, Forestry, Ferry Division, and all of our 100 counties and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So going further to develop ways that they understand that we are wide open regarding situational awareness, communicating at a high level with them during events, but not just that, blue skies, how we can help them, meeting with them, what do you need? We ask that a lot. So our focus has been a little bit different, I think, than in the past, in that we try to focus on getting partners to understand that we want them to stay in business. We want them to remain operational. We want them to be in those communities where they serve and to keep going. What can we do to enhance that? So engaging folks from that side and hearing what we can do for them and then acting on those things, I would say that that's probably something we do well. And I think it served us well in pulling private sector into things that normally they wouldn't be involved in, recovery, blue sky events, getting them into the EOC for business meetings if they want to, because our EOC is open to every citizen in North Carolina. So I take a few extra steps to try to do that. I try to find out what you do. I try to find out what Kelly does. I try to find out what Tom does. I ask questions. The private sector educates me, and that gives me time to sit around and think of creative ways that maybe we can address things and get more flexible. So, the guys on this panel, folks listening here, they have taught me and brought me along, opening the door to more that what government can do to engage private sector. And it means listening to comments, suggestions. I've gotten the most amazing ideas from some comment that maybe Tom Farmer made, or, that maybe Kelly made, thinking, I can work with that. So I think that's the best way that we engage. We've stretched ourselves with humility of what can we do. And I don't know that historically we've always done a good job of that in government.
That was great, Persia. Love the way you expanded on the idea of not only creating the conversation, but extending the conversation and taking the time to truly understand your partners. It's a great way to think about it. Tom, I think that many of us try to foster blue sky conversations and learn about our partners. But I think you pull some things out of an exercise that you might not pull out of just a regular conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on what you learn in an exercise that you might not learn from just talking to somebody at a meeting?
Sure. No, great question. And I'll give you the first baseball analogy. So I'm a fan of the Mets, and Tom Seaver is our most well-known player. Passed away, unfortunately, too young, at 75, a couple of years ago. And in interviews, he would talk about how he got ready for game situations. And so he related the story looking forward to playing the San Francisco Giants, who at the time, their most dangerous hitter was a very big man named Willie McCovey, and ended up hitting over 500 home runs and got into the Hall of Fame. And he put himself in this worst case scenario, bases loaded, no place to put McCovey. It's a 3-2 count. What am I going to throw him? And lo and behold, what happens when he actually pitches against the Giants? He's in precisely that situation. What he decided to throw when he was envisioning it was a changeup, a pitch that was not really one of his better ones, but one he hoped McCovey wouldn't expect. And that's what he did in the actual situation. And McCovey swung and missed. And for years later, every time there was a reunion at the Hall of Fame, McCovey would see Seaver and yell across the room, "Look at Seaver throwing me a changeup on 3-2 with the bases loaded. Who does this guy think he is?" Now, why do I tell that story? I think Kent's question gets to the point of why we exercise and some of the unique attributes of the SICE exercises. So many times we participate in exercises and a lot of effort is devoted to creating fictional scenarios. Well, with the SICE exercises, we don't talk about fictional scenarios. We talk about events that actually happen. And so the participants are relating not what they would do, but what they actually did in the particular situation. And what I found from those exercises is a lot more learning happens because you're talking specifically about here's how I put our plan of attack into place. Here's how we shared information. Here's what we offered to our partners. To Kent's point, you can have a lot of what are termed blue sky conversations, and we have a very robust exercise program in our industry. We also have the benefit of Proud to experience. Railroads deal with disruptions to their service from natural events all the time. But what you don't get, the benefit you don't get from that setting is the challenges, the opportunities that flow from interacting with representatives of other sectors, representatives of federal government, state and local government. I had long been a strict advocate of blanket access for critical infrastructure workers as part of response efforts. And then as part of the SICE exercises, I heard Persia talk in terms of some of the challenges that blanket access would cause as they're trying to manage an incident and keep some semblance of order in areas impacted. And so I'm able to take a lesson from that experience, that exposure, and bring that back to my own organization and say, look, we need to refine our position a bit. We don't need blanket access. We do need access that state authorities can respect and understand and to communicate that in a way that they can accept. And so our own practice enhanced dramatically. We've now gone several years without any disruption to our repair crews, response crews getting to sites of incidents, whether they're natural like hurricanes, accidental like a derailment, or man-made, because of the benefit of that perspective and some adjustments we made to our practice. And I can go through a litany of examples where exposure to some of the expertise assembled for the SICE exercises has allowed me to take away insights that have made our own practice better. So there's a very unfortunate term that has a military background. It says no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In our case, we can refine it to say no plan survives first contact with the adversary. And that adversary can be a natural disaster like a hurricane is one example. I think that's a bad term because it's not true. The planning gives you the foundation that makes your performance possible. The exercises where you try to put your plan into effect and test it and stress it give you the insights to make it better and enhance your capabilities. And the expertise assembled by the SICE for these exercises gives you a broader perspective that makes you better going forward. So all of that factors into the planning that we bring forward. And my own view is every plan survives first contact with the enemy because you've exercised it, you've prepared it, and you've created the flexibility to adjust it based on those preparations. And that's a lot of what we've gained from the SICE work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Great overview there. Really appreciate that. As I reflect on exercises, it is really a potential universe of issues or scenarios you could create or ways you could approach an exercise. But that's way too broad. Persia, can you talk a little bit about how the SICE focused on the exercise requirements that were put in place?
Yeah, I can. Like you mentioned, it's such a broad, it's such a broad scope out there of what you can focus on. And we've all sat through many exercises. But what we tried to really look at is a few basic items that we knew were going to be important to the private sector. What is going to be the most important? What can government do? And kind of pare that down to like 5 or 6 things and deciding what those are. So we wanted them to be items that are typically needed, always requested, critical to doing setup for a disaster, say a known event like pre-positioning equipment, critical to making sure that things could be in motion on the private side. We had to get in sync with, did our timelines make sense with what private sector needed to do from an operational standpoint to be in place to support a response. And we weren't looking at all of that all the time. So those items, particularly declarations of emergency, transportation waivers, some of the communications that I talk to my counterparts all the time being on a battle rhythm, and we didn't name it this, having communication steadily every day, all the time, so that the private sector knows when that information is coming. So we tried to, and I think we did a good job of cleaning up all the vast arrays of things it could have been. And I don't know if you have that slide handy of what we used, because it was showing on the video of those 6 items, but getting down to brass tacks and not just deciding what they were going to be. You know, a lot of the cross-sector folks looked at these and said, hey, do you think these are important enough? Do you think this makes sense? Are these those critical 5 or 6 things? And that's kind of like the baseline. You know, can it expand past that? Sure it can. But these are relevant to all sectors, critical infrastructure, healthcare, everybody.
Laura, can we put that slide up for just a minute? Let our audience see that. Okay, we'll follow up and see if we can get that up on the screen. And if not, it was in the previous video, and we'll make it available for, here it comes. There we
there
go.
it comes. There we go. So the declarations and waivers, like I mentioned, guidance and updates, you know, when is that information coming, especially on government actions? You know, in my state, you know, we try to do this in real time by granting WebEOC access so folks can see everything that's happening on the operation, what facilities are open and closed. So these are 2 things. You see the ones on the left, sectors that what the private sector needs before landfall and what the states need after landfall. So we kind of broke it down. What does government need? What does private sector need? Infrastructure disruptions, obviously those things are critical to the government side. I think Ron Robbins was talking about it, that it's critical for them to know what is happening, what supply chain limitations, you know, what things are not going to happen, what are we absolutely down on, especially on lifelines as we notate those red, yellow, green, information requests. You know, this goes both ways, situational awareness, 2-way street, not a 1-way street. So I think these 6 areas, 3 on private, 3 on public, this is what we tried to focus on. And I think we achieved that. And I think it's worthwhile for anyone to listen to the input from private sector on, you know, whether or not this information made sense from a standpoint of starting out the exercise this way with this basic information. I think, and I want to see what Kelly has to say about it too, in terms of how we pared this down, because it was a lot of things we could have looked at, but this seemed to be the most important on both sides.
Okay, that's perfect, Persia, and thanks for putting that up, Laura. You can go ahead and take that down now. You know, for people who are, or for any professional who's preparing an exercise, always great to go in with some high-level objectives, some specific things you want to try and get out of the exercise. And I think Persia did a great job of illustrating how the SICE approached that for this effort. And then you get really into that next level of detail of planning and preparing for an exercise. And Tom, could you give us an overview of how the SICE prepared for its exercises?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. While I was not directly involved in the planning process that produced the exercises, as a participant, I certainly saw the benefit of that work. I think the most beneficial approach is the focus on not a manufactured scenario, but actual events, and walking through in a very structured way of what organizations actually did at various stages of the management of the incident. And so the SICE approach, using Hurricane Ida as an example from New Orleans it was September 2021 in Louisiana, the exercise walked through, here's X days or hours in advance of projected landfall, through the response and recovery process for days afterward. And again, at each juncture, whether it was a private sector participant representing particular industries impacted by the storm, or state and local government representatives who were participating, there was specific discussion of what the respective exercise participants were doing at the time the various events were taking place on this progression of the incident. Why is that beneficial? Because it helps you get a very good understanding of the challenges that the participants face, how they overcome those challenges, and then what opportunities may be present for expanded collaboration through information sharing and through the various capabilities that both government organizations and private sector entities can bring to bear. And this last point's particularly important. There's a lot of effort, and it's an admirable effort. And the last presentation on ESF 14 really brings it out. And I commend the participants in ESF 14 at FEMA, at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Well, they do exceptional work. I lived in Northwest Florida, serving at Tyndall Air Force Base in the mid to late 1990s. And we had 4 hurricanes, one of which was a major storm, Category 4. I don't recall seeing anything approaching the level of effort that goes now into the response for hurricanes. It is a development in which all involved should take a great deal of pride. The amount of effort that goes into relief efforts, response, recovery, both government and private sector. But in the course of the exercise, what you begin to realize is you kind of that big picture approach that ESF 14 has to take. With the SICE exercise, you're focusing more on where are the problems that may not surface to that higher level. And by focusing on those problems, that's where you identify the opportunities to make a difference. And I'll give a practical example, brief practical example. This dates back to Hurricane Irma, I think August, September timeframe of 2017. And its biggest impacts occurred in Central Florida. And railroad operations ceased in advance of a hurricane. Usually a couple of days in advance, the drawdown of operations begins. The challenge that emerged is there was some animal feed supplies that did not get delivered. And so you had a stretch of time before the hurricane made landfall, then the hurricane hits, then you've got the effects of the hurricane, most pronounced in Central Florida. One of my learning points here, my last name is Farmer, but I had no idea there was a dairy industry in Central Florida. I came to learn that as a result of this. But the lack of a capability to get the grain to the farmers for their livestock created a crisis. And they're on the verge of starving animals. And so the sort of work that you do with the SICE, the sort of work that sets the foundation for planning that I alluded to earlier, you have the understanding of who the right connection points are to try to make a difference. So the food and agriculture sector identified the pressing problem. From work they had done in exercises like the SICE sponsors, they would recognize that this is normally delivered by train. We don't want to substitute that. We want to try to accelerate it. Let's reach out to the railroad industry. That then empowered me to be able to go to my railroads, specifically CSX, and talk about what could be done to marshal the resources to relieve this problem. Remarkably, at CSX, they were able to actually scour their network, find out where the feed cars were that were destined for Florida, marshal 2 grain trains, and then with a concerted effort to clear the tracks in Central Florida, get the commodity to the place where it was needed to avert a crisis. All of that happens because of the testing you do of your plans and procedures and the exercises, because of the contacts you make, and because of the recognition that grows as you participate in these forums of the opportunities for collaboration that can make that sort of difference. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. I think we have all been to meetings where we've had good conversations and left having enjoyed the time and probably a few more business cards in your pocket, but didn't get a lot of other value from the meeting. Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on the value and the outcomes from the exercise and what made it worth the investment in the time and energy?
Yeah, Kent, to me, it's the most important question. What is the value of an exercise for preparedness? And, I guess the best way to put it is to think about the moment, I call it the moment of truth, the moment that you're in the midst of that major disaster, whatever it may be. It can be a hurricane response. It could be a It could be other kinds of severe weather. It can be power outages, whatever it may be. You know, there's always that moment that usually comes in the first hour when you finally get a clear-eyed view of the magnitude of what it is that you're facing, right? And at the same time, you understand, you've talked to your team, you understand where your assets are, where your team is. And so you have a clear sense of what your ability to manage that disaster is. And in most cases, there's a dramatic gap there. There's a shortfall. There's a you can't get big enough, fast enough to deal with the multitude of problems that are coming at you. And it's a painful time. It's a very painful moment. I call it the moment of truth. And so in that moment of truth, there are insights. What happens is that voice in your head, there's a voice in your head, and it's saying to you, you know, first of all, it's like, why did you ever get into this business? You were doing so good as an engineer. What the hell made you want to do this? And then it's like, well, and people, now it's it. Well, you're not going to do it anymore because this is where it all goes to hell. This is where you fail. This is where you get fired. This is where you're going to be at the Starbucks again, but this time asking, you know, if they have any openings behind the counter as a barista, right? So, and along with that, right, comes, for me anyway, I'm obviously talking about myself, a flood of insights. I wish I had done this. I wish I had done that. If I had just, you know, talked to these other team members over there and I had moved a couple of things, or if I had plugged in this hospital over here, or I wish I'd had talked to, you know, New Brunswick, New Jersey, like I was going to talk to that emergency manager over there. Now I need something over there. I wish I had done that. So there's all these wishes. There's all these tasks. You're like, if I had done these couple of things that I knew I was supposed to do, I'd be in a much better spot right now. And so those insights come in the job. So they come hard and they come fast, and there's a lot of regret. And if there's one thing that I do, I try to live my life and minimize the regret for not having done something. That's why I'm always rushing around trying to do things, because I don't want to regret not having done something. But you know, so you get a lot of insight, and it's good. And in the aftermath of that job, ultimately you get through it. You find yourself still employed, and then you do the after action report, and then you go back and do those things. You know, you go back and you plug in those things that you wish you plugged in. So what an exercise does is it allows you to gain some of those, not all of those insights, but it allows you to gain some of those insights without the pain, you know, without that pain. And but you have to craft the game. You know, in my view, and this is the other sort of, you know, Kellyism, right? The other, take it or leave it, because it's one person's opinion. But, you know, I've been to so many exercises that were not well constructed, and because they really devolved into meetings. Everybody in the exercise was like, you'd be like, okay, so and so, you know, it's you know, this is what's happening, and you're embattled, and you've got this and this. What are you doing right now? And then they would say, well, according to our plan, you know, I would have my assets arrayed across the, you know, and it's all just show business, right? And so, you know, you walk out of that, and usually it's like, those are the long ones. This is an hour and a half or 2 hours. When you walk out scratching your head going like, I'm never going to get that 2 hours of my life back. I mean, it's like, what a tragic event that was. So I also want to avoid those. I want to avoid those exercises, because there's nothing worse and more boring than a bad exercise. So it has to be well crafted. It has to be imaginative. You have to have a good scenario, and we call it reasonable worst case. Reasonable worst case. So it's bad. It's a bad scenario. Something really bad is happening. It's a worst case scenario, but it's reasonable, right? So it's plausible. So you don't have, you know, the earthquake combined with the Sharknado, right? Don't just, you know, it's like, what do they say? Who said it? You know, don't just say no. Say no to somebody's just like, hey, you know, I want to understand more about this. Can we put that in? And then they layer on these these additions of the scenario until it gets to be implausible. So don't make it implausible, make it a reasonable worst case scenario, but make it bad. And then you have to spend a lot of time in the planning phase ironing out the details and really, what time of day was it? Who was involved? Where was it? You got to nail those details down. So when you describe it to people, there's not contradictions in the scenario. And so you set it up, you talk about it, you present the scenario, and then you call StartX, right? And that's the game, that's the simulation. And you tell people, don't tell me what you would do. Don't tell me what your plan says. Tell me what you are doing. Don't tell me what you would say. Just say it. It's happening. Say it. And if you can get people to do that, if you can get people to engage and act as if, to me, that really becomes insightful. It becomes interesting. It becomes fun, and it's a worthwhile way to spend your time. And again, you're not going to get all those painful insights from a real job, but you'll carry one or two or even more over, and and that could be enormously valuable in an actual job. And I'll go back to one other thing I was going to say. I love Tom's baseball analogy. I'm a Yankee fan, so if it had been anybody but Seaver. No, I like Tom Seaver. Tom Seaver's a great pitcher. But he talked about how they did that. They imagined that, and what turned out in the game was identical to what their scenario was that they made up. And I got to tell you, I find that to happen. That's more than coincidental. So many of the exercises that we've done have turned around, and very similar things have happened. And then people come back to you and they're like, wow, do you have a crystal ball? Like, what are you doing? So it's not hard to find scenarios that, can ultimately bear out in a real job.
That's great, Kelly. Thank you for all of that. I think we've done a pretty good job at this point of kind of laying the foundation for why we went down the path of these cross-functional exercises and some of the lessons learned coming from them, or some of the actions that took to develop them. But I want to start to look ahead just a little bit as we get towards the end of our discussion. And starting with, Tom, Kelly talked about that after action review. We obviously did one of those for the SICE exercises. What do you think the big lessons were coming out of the after action review?
Based on the experience I had with the exercise, and I think this perspective was shared by a lot of the participants. I talked earlier about the daily private sector outreach calls held by ESF 14, and an invaluable service they are, giving us a broad perspective on what's happening with a serious incident. But what came out of the SICE exercises was the value of having a more compact forum, if you would. The federal exercises, the federal coordination calls have to be very broad. They're covering all sectors. There's involvement of multiple government agencies. There's a lot of presentation, a lot of briefings, a lot of updates have to be provided. So that consumes a substantial portion of the time. The forum doesn't allow itself much opportunity for the discussion of pressing needs and potential solutions for them. With the SICE exercises, we actually developed a process which you would have a compact period of time to have those sort of focused discussions. And so actually in the exercise, there are opportunities for this conference call that the exercise facilitator organized. And it was each government representative that was participating in the exercise, so state and local for the area that was impacted, and private sector representatives who are participating, a quick update. What are your preparations if we're talking pre-landfall for a hurricane? What are those preparations entailed? And what are you doing to be ready for impact? Once impact happens, what sort of effects have caused any sorts of concerns in terms of your operations of your sector. What actions are being taken in terms of response? Are there any challenges that you're encountering? These are quick updates, snapshot of what's happening in each sector. Those updates, concisely managed, and each of the participants did a really good job of keeping them concise and pointed, helped identify the opportunities where there were needs that merited attention, and as the briefings went on, capabilities to address those. So as an example, with Hurricane Ida, we found a pressing need in central Louisiana resulted from down power lines across railroad infrastructure. We couldn't restore operations on a major line into New Orleans from Chicago because of that. Well, the ability to express that in a concise way triggered the engagement of the electricity sector and a cooperative effort to work with the utility, which is facing myriad demands in responding to the incident, and really raised for them the importance of trying to get crews out to remove these down lines from the tracks, because once that happens, the flow really begins of the sort of commodities that are essential to the relief effort and to the longer term response and recovery. So this SICE forum, this exercise forum, actually produced an effective practice. And that effective practice is this concise brief where each government agency participant, each sector representative is giving a status update. And it really allowed for identifying needs and seeing where there are opportunities to solve problems. And so we appreciate that. That to me is a tangible outcome from an exercise, as was stated earlier. Too often the exercise itself seems to be the metric. In this case, the metric was, is there something this exercise told us would work well? And we did it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. We've got just a couple more questions we're going to cover here. If you have a question in the audience, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. I think we'll have time for one or two. With that, let me turn to Kelly. Will the SICE do more exercises in the future?
Yeah, Ken, absolutely. The SICE has several in the works, and it has a lot of use cases that it's working on, and that a use case is really a problem set. And so it's talking about a lot of them, and I'm not at liberty to share them right now, but there are definitely different industry sectors that we're talking with, and different scenarios we're talking about, but they want to grow, especially the consortium wants to grow the number and variety of exercises that we do throughout the year. So I think it's done half a dozen, but in an average year going forward, they want to do at least that many.
That's great. That's great perspective. That repetition just makes everyone more able to respond as we go forward. Persia, I'm going to give you the philosophical question. Where do you think the SICE takes the exercise program from here?
Hey, thanks, Ken. I think from here, the program can easily be expanded, certainly to other disasters, looking at after action items for corrective actions on disasters we witnessed, because that's the beauty of this program, that we can actually look at a real event. I think we can always respond faster and better. It's important too, I think, to look at going forward the huge educational value of this exercise. New folks to your organization, especially new folks to your operations or logistics that listen into this on the government side, operations logistics folks opening their minds to a greater understanding of all the moving pieces. And I think a good example of that on both sides were when we were looking at this exercise, and this format's a little bit different. You know, this isn't your HSEEP format. It's very fortunate that the All Hazards was willing to look at a different way to view exercises. And I like getting to the nitty gritty. And so I admit I was able to inject a bit of that. And what it meant was we were able to get into the entire picture and down into the operation and really focus on problems. I'm going to see more of that going forward, going into the exercise with a problem in mind. We've seen that scenario before. We know what we did. We can better examine what we did wrong and look at active solutions focused on those mistakes. I'll call them corrective action. So testing the plan live, this group comes, maybe someone that's never exercised before, they want to look at their plan versus this real scenario, hearing us go through it and be able to evaluate that plan and make tweaks, maybe before the next disaster happens. So being better prepared, I think, is where this is going. This is going to be a tool to better prepare everybody. So examining what we could have done better, looking at the other options we have, the private sector laying things out for us clearly so that government can get whether or not they need to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And that's true engagement for me. Do we need to get out of the way? Is this a problem government needs to be involved in, or do we just need to support that? So I want to see that go forward. Definitely want to see more groups on the private side get involved. The critical infrastructure sectors that we identified, it seems that's expanding every day. And we know that sometimes it's disaster driven. I mean, during the pandemic, who would have thought that Bob's bicycles would have become a critical infrastructure for North Carolina when everybody started biking? I'm just giving that as an example. Obviously, it's small scale, but you can imagine what I mean. We're leaving out maybe some folks who I'd like to see included. Those support groups that support all of our other critical infrastructure. I know that the folks that support rail, for instance, those small companies and groups, maybe they can really benefit from this to help enhance those problems, that builds resiliency. People that support the Verizons and the little guy that's refueling the generator at the towers, he might be a little guy, but he might be critical with a big problem in a big scenario. So I want to see it expand. I know it'll be difficult, and I think my colleagues here can talk about it. There is a bit of an issue when you get too big. So keeping it small, I think, is going to be a challenge, or small enough to really do great things. But I think this group can handle that, because I like the more the merrier. I think the more the educational value of this is worth it. So that's where I see it going. I see it expanding, focusing on particular problems. And I'm hoping that some of the things that we don't see common in disasters begin to come out. Like, we know sometimes it isn't just one disaster. Sometimes it's a lot of simultaneous things happening. We know that we typically don't get involved directly in nuclear power plant issues, for instance, but there's a lot of cascading impacts that occur because of those issues that we're not really directly addressing. I know we don't like to get into communications issues, like what happens if everything goes out or we don't have WebEOC and that kind of thing, but getting into our PACE, someone mentioned it yesterday, our primary alternate contingency and emergency communications. So there's a lot of pieces, and I want to see us hit some of the harder problems in the future.
All right, Persia, that's a great way to kind of wrap up the discussion today. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, so I think what I'm going to do is move us to a bit of a wrap up. I always like to kind of summarize the main lessons for me, and there were so many great thoughts and great philosophies brought forward today, but I'll share with you three of my favorite. First one I wrote down was, don't ask fourth date questions on the first date. So Persia, want to say thank you for that one. Second, we got Kelly, keep it real, no Sharknadoes in the exercise. So another great one for everyone to keep in mind. And finally, from Tom, your plan will not survive first contact with the event, but the plan is a basis for change, which will make you successful. So great way to kind of wrap things up. I know that there were a ton of other points brought forward, and I hope that everyone got as much out of the discussion today as I did. I'll just close out by thanking Tom, Persia, and Kelly for participating today. One of the reasons that I personally participate in the SICE is I am amazed by the breadth and depth of experience and knowledge that people like them bring forward and share very freely with the other members of the site. So thank you not only for your participation today, but your ongoing friendship and mentorship that you probably not knowingly are aware that you offer, but you do. So thank you for all that. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it back back to Del. I think we've got a couple minutes before the next session. It'll give everyone a chance to hit the refrigerator and refresh their beverage and their snacks before the next session. Del?
Yes, perfect. Hey, thank you so much, everybody. And a little comment, since we have just a moment, we're going to queue up a quick video that's going to pop in here in just a second. So to your point about the whole exercising, it really boils down to two things, two simple concepts. It's about relationships and it's about muscle memory. So I think the key takeaways are when you may not have all the information, but you need to make decisions. You need to allocate resources and position them properly. You need to ramp up to a battle rhythm. The whole idea behind the exercise is so you know in advance who to call, what to ask for, or what to offer in a mutual aid situation. And also having that mutual trust that if at all possible, given the conditions on the ground, that it'll happen as soon as physically possible. And I think with that, hey, great panel, folks. We all win by being part of this. And Kent, and to your thought-provoking panelists, Tom, Persia, and Kelly, thank you so much, folks, for sharing all of your experience. Greatly appreciate it.